this close link between electrical power and political power. Doesn't matter what country you're in, there's always been a very, very close link. And when you start to decentralize electrical power, it's going to be really interesting to see what impact it has on the political power.
Hello and welcome back to the Hypercube Podcast. This morning I'm joined by Dr. Steven Fawkes, who is Managing Partner of EP Group. Steven, thanks so much for joining us. Would you like to introduce yourself and EP Group for the audience, please?
Sure. Thanks, Adam. Good to be here. So I'm Steve Fawkes, Managing Partner at EP. And at EP, we have a mission of accelerating the shift to net zero and a regenerative economy. And we do that by combining progressive ownership structures with some catalytic capital. And within that group, we have a number of companies. We have a consultancy that works with corporates, investors in the public sector, an architecture practice focused on sustainable buildings, a JV with the Indian state-owned energy efficiency company that's invested £60 million here in the UK, and a partnership with an investment bank that raises capital, and a JV with Pixie AS, which is a Norwegian battery integrator. And with that joint venture, we're developing distributed energy projects. So I suppose my role is really to spot opportunities and put resources together and a bit of catalytic capital and get them going. So I suppose that is a classic entrepreneurial role.
Yeah, I was going to say no 2 months can be the same, surely, in a role like that.
Well, that's right. Yeah. Sometimes people have difficulty understanding what we do, but that's what we do. And we like the variety. And there's so many different fields to do good stuff in that we like to do that.
Yeah. And I always think that energy's like that in that it's just naturally messy. You've got land, buildings, like assets, capital, all that. It's requires a lot of greasing of wheels and very clever people wading through mountains of documentation. I guess like when we had the warm-up call for this episode, you had some fascinating insights, and like you've seen quite a few changes over and across the energy sector. If you look back from like where we are today, what's the kind of most interesting changes you've lived through, or what do you see was the least foreseen?
Well, I think back then, and we're talking about the early 80s, so 40 years, although it's hard to imagine, I think the changes have been literally unbelievable. If we could have seen what we know now, back then we would not have believed it. So, I mean, a couple of examples that come to mind. Back then, we had a subsidy program to help industrial users switch boilers from oil to coal in the name of energy security. And there, of course, there were pilot solar and wind projects in various parts of the world, all very small, all government paid for, all subsidized. And we talked about renewables as alternative energy. I mean, the standard view of the future that we're now living in, was that energy would be dominated by co-nuco, as it was called, which is coal, nuclear, and conservation. We just could not have imagined back then the growth of renewables and storage. You know, we always talked about storage as being almost impossible other than pumped hydro storage. And of course, there was a sort of burgeoning environmental movement, but we didn't really talk about global warming. And then finally, I think the big change is that energy and the whole energy transition has become, I'm not sure this is the right word, but sort of fashionable and attractive to entrepreneurs, as well as open to the private sector. Whereas back then, it was all dominated by big companies, nearly all publicly owned monopolies, all controlled directly by the government. So when you add all that up, both the technical, the market, and the, I suppose, organisational changes, they're all fairly incredible to have seen that change.
I once attended a talk by like global CEO of one of the world's biggest banks, and they were talking aligned to that point of environment and climate stuff being fashionable. And they talked about how they had $1 trillion in under management, or $1 trillion invested in asset classes and products that had to move from where they were, and they were pointing it all at green. Effectively, it all had to go green. And you just think, like, at that scale, the numbers are daft. And that you can then see how when a big, enormous bank like that makes a statement like that or sets out a 15-year plan to do something like that, the natural consequences then, private equity, venture capital, like it all kind of follows suit, and you can see what happens. Interesting, like we spoke before, you said that we're probably only about halfway through the transition. What do you think, like that, from your longer term perspective? It must be easier for you not to get lost in the day-to-day and the immediate, the next 6 months or whatever the hype cycle is talking about now. Like, impart some wisdom on us from your point of view.
I suppose it's absolutely right that we have a very high level of ambition, but as you say, the change is absolutely enormous. You're talking about every building, every vehicle, every piece of infrastructure, all of that needs to be changed. And I think I was always a fan of science fiction, and one of my favorite science fiction writers was Arthur C. Clarke. And he once said, we always overestimate what we can do in the short term and underestimate what we can do in the long term. So you get lots of little changes that add up to a big change in 40 years or so. And also I think people still forget about S-curves. These things do move in S-curves. So they move slowly for a long, long time, what seems like a long time, and then they suddenly flip up. And we've seen that obviously with solar batteries and EVs recently, that we're just really getting into that high growth part of the S-curve. So I think that sort of view of change is really, really important to understand S-curves, but also, as you say, the scale of it is massive.
The S-curve piece is like, there's analogues to what's going on in AI as well, right? So AI has been around forever and it's been moving at a pace, it's been doing well. And then 3 years ago, woof, it's all changed and it's dominating everything. Every company's now an AI company. And so we're seeing it play out there. And it's having a knock-on effect on the forward planning for energy systems and how some of the hyperscalers are going to hoover up all the clean water and all the power to generate more AI. And not quite sure how that all plays out in the long run.
Yep.
I was talking to people in Texas a while back about, it was just at the time, is it the Stargate or the Fargate project and it was like 500 billion investment. And I said, look, 30% of that's going to be energy infrastructure, probably more. Like, it's all well and good buying chips and data centers, but have you got the capacity to run them at that scale? I think, wanted to touch on your blog, only 11%, and highlighting how inefficient the current system is. Like, why do you think we're not so great at energy efficiency? We're all very good at new technologies, like just more oomph, but why is that not getting the attention it quite deserves?
Well, of course, it never has. And part of the problem fundamentally is that it's invisible. It's the absence of energy use. It's also really hard to stick a meter on it, although we now do have metered efficiency as a concept using smart metering and clever algorithms. But I mean, another reason is it's just quite, and this was a really hard thing to accept after many years working in the industry, that fundamentally energy efficiency is boring for most people most of the time. It's just dull. And I think even saving money, which is often equated with saving money, it's like if I said to you, I'll give you £100 or I'll save you £100, I think you'll probably take the £100 in cash rather than the savings. It's just fairly dull. And as I say, that was hard to accept, but it's true. And I think you have to accept it to recognize the barriers. Also, particularly as engineers, and I am an engineer, we do love fancy big equipment like big wind turbines or engines or trucks or boats or whatever it is. And energy efficiency tends to be this little aggregation of tiny, tiny little things, everything from thermostats to more efficient controls, more efficient light bulbs even. And as I always joke, it was a kind of thing in the 70s in the oil crisis to stick foil behind radiators. And a lot of my elderly relatives thought for a long while that's what I did every day. It's pretty dull. But I've never actually stuck foil behind radiators.
Yeah, it's always time. The next gas price spike or whatever. Yeah, I get that. And I was actually had a call this morning about that very thing within delivering technology and how, like, it's so easy to inflate the scope or just deploy more technology because most of the people that are in engineering roles do it because they love that bit. Whereas like turning things off and sort of making things smaller, or like, that's just not as fun. It's not like what you were doing when you were a child, dreaming of building things. And who doesn't want to order a great big wind turbine blade and
Well, exactly. It's much more fun. And those are real barriers. They're human barriers, I suppose.
So there's been a huge push towards electrification, though, in recent years. We're seeing it happen. I think the electrification of transportation is like kind of brought that on a lot, and then you get the cyclical knock-on effects of better investment in battery technology plays out into that self-perpetuating cycle. Like, how do you see the relationship between electrification and the efficiency? And like, is there anywhere that we're getting it wrong, or industry is getting the balance quite wrong?
Yeah, I think obviously that's become quite a debate recently, in a way, that the difference between electrification and efficiency, or the potential conflict almost between them two. But you have to think about the system level that you're talking about, because clearly if you electrify heat or you electrify transport, and especially, of course, if it's electrified with renewable power, you do get this massive gain in efficiency. Because if you're taking out a power station, which is a 30% efficiency, maybe 40 if it's a state of the art, you inherently have a great big efficiency saving, but that's at a different level. If you're talking about sticking a heat pump into a house and you don't do anything to the house on its actual energy efficiency level, the amount of energy used is the same. So at that level of the system, there is no energy efficiency. But if that's renewable power driving a heat pump instead of gas or power coming through a fossil fuel power station, there's a big energy efficiency saving in the system. So I think it's important to think about the system. The thing that I sort of object to now is there's this school of thought that if we have abundant cheap solar and batteries, which we're beginning to get, we shouldn't worry about individual appliances or buildings and their efficiency. And I fundamentally disagree with that, because I think, first of all, if you improve the efficiency of a building or an appliance, it has savings throughout the system all the way back to your solar farm and everything else. Plus, so it would take less capital. Plus, of course, I think, as I wrote in a blog a long time ago, was about the elegance of design. It's just so much more elegant to have energy efficient appliances than inefficient appliances. Even if your power is free and abundant, why design something and put up with something that's not efficient? It's just so much better, and we definitely need more elegance in the world. So I think energy efficient design is elegant. I think also with electrification, this sort of efficiency first versus electrification first is now, as I say, a hot topic. But I think it's absolutely right to make the building or the end use as efficient as it's viable to do. And of course, that could be a lot or it might not be much, but you have to look at what's viable on each individual site. And that includes the technology, the economics, the human factors. Some places you can do it, some places you can't. I live in a block built in 1900, and it'd be really hard to put any significant energy efficiency on it, other than a full-scale, massive cost passive house retrofit. But we could use a heat pump, so the system would be saving. We wouldn't necessarily be saving energy at the building level.
Yeah, and it's funny, that's definitely the engineering you speaking, just the elegance around energy efficiency. The reality of it, I think, like, people don't think about the second, third order effects, and like, okay, fine, there's loads of solar now, wonderful, and there's abundant generation. That doesn't change the big problem in energy, which is the transmission system and high voltage skilled and high voltage manufacturing. Like, all that whole part of the system is a huge bottleneck. So just add more solar doesn't solve the problem, whereas make everything more efficient does. And I think secondarily, like, yeah, I've lived in, I now live in a new build, but I lived in lovely tenement in Glasgow, and like, no one that I know that lives in a tenement is satisfied with how warm and how cozy and how easy it is to heat. They're lovely houses, but it's hard, right? Because they're just not built with modern materials, modern construction approaches. And so I think it's when you get into the lived experience of humans in inefficient environments, you can just sense the dissatisfaction, the kind of flavour of it, right?
Yeah, and you don't, that's absolutely right. You don't realize how bad it is unless you go and stay in a passive house or live in a passive house. And then you suddenly realize how comfortable they are. And actually, your whole life you've been uncomfortable, but almost
Mm.
unconsciously because that's the norm, like having cold walls that you're radiating to heat to makes a difference.
So you've worked at the intersection of energy and finance, and I think it's like a really interesting place to like the people that work in this space because it's quite niche but really impactful, and it's not just like derivatives and financial products that mere mortals can't understand. It's building stuff and like things that relate to every day. In your experience, what makes like a good energy project? Like what makes it investable, and why is efficiency, like large scale efficiency, kind of struggled historically on that front?
Well, I mean, first of all, of course, any investment has to have financial returns if it's a private sector investment. I think the team who are designing, executing it are critical and all the contracting around it. And I suppose all of that adds up to de-risking, something that has been talked about a bit more recently about how do you de-risk projects. And then the scale issue is really important because financial institutions, in the city or anywhere else, can only sensibly deploy millions of pounds in one go because the transaction costs are so high. And also, as I've said many times, and they don't really like this, but banks and financial institutions are just factories. They can only deal with standardized products financed in a standardized way. And as we said earlier, energy efficiency comes in very small packages. It's hard to measure. It's got high transaction cost. It does have some risks, despite energy efficiency people saying for years it didn't. And therefore, it's kind of hard to invest in. And those things all add up. So, yeah, scale, risk, transaction cost, team, implementation, de risking.
As a bootstrap startup founder that's been around the merry-go-round with a few private equity, venture capital types, I can sense echoes of that standard product, standard understanding of what makes a business. And yeah, when you don't quite fit the mold, it makes life quite hard. You've talked about standardization in the sector and how it's critical if we want like real markets to form, especially for energy efficiency. It'd be good to just like expand and define. There's a lot of non-financial people here like in the audience, so define that. What does that mean, and what are the benefits, and what does it bring to us if we can achieve it?
Sure. Well, standardization is absolutely essential for any market or financial market. And it's a bit like going to a greengrocer. You buy a kilogram of potatoes, for instance, the kilogram is standardized. I mean,
Mm.
obviously, in the past, maybe even today, there's people who fiddle it and lean on the scale or whatever, but you're buying a standard unit, and so you can have a market. And it's the same for any of the financial markets. We talk about commodities markets like the Chicago Board of Trade or whatever it's called now, where you buy a bushel of wheat or a pork belly future, but all of those are really defined. And it also, even if you think of something closer to home, like a car loan or a mortgage, if every car loan or mortgage had to be a bespoke document done in a bespoke way, you just wouldn't have that kind of market, which is absolutely essential. And the problem with efficiency is traditionally the way that projects have been developed and engineered has been very non-standard. And I think that's partly because it was never really big enough to justify developing standards. Whereas, when wind power came along, originally there was no standard way of assessing a project. And then pretty quickly, the banks and everybody agreed a standard way of it. But in energy efficiency, it was never worth it. And that's why we introduced something called the Investor Confidence Project to Europe, which came from the US, and we brought it to Europe with assistance from the European Commission. And that introduced this standardized way of developing and documenting energy efficiency projects. And when we did that, it was proven to reduce transaction cost because people didn't feel the need to go and hire a separate engineer to review the project. And it reduced performance risks. So, we worked with a big insurance company that was insuring projects. And they said, if you have a project developed to this standard, we will charge you a lower fee for insuring it. So that kind of proved the principle. But unfortunately, it's still not widely used. I think the energy efficiency people tend to view their little kind of way of calculating things as proprietary, and fundamentally it's not. But As I always say, if you had 4 energy engineers work out the savings from a simple LED project, you probably get 4 different ways of calculating it. And that just doesn't work for banks and financial institutions, because they look at one and go, oh, and look at another one and go, this one's different. What can we do?
Let's not compute, and that's it, out, baby out with the
Yeah,
bathwater.
exactly.
No,
Easier to say no.
Yeah, that's like, yeah, exactly. And I think people forget that, like, that's actually the default, is to say no, because it's the cost of a kind of false positive or whatever is so high. When I think about systems like that, like, why is it that way? And it's, well, built by humans over decades, and like we are converging on a core truth, or maybe circling it for years, but we never arrive there. And lawyers and financiers and consultants, they're very human professionals, like the professions that require expertise and things. And now what we're seeing with AI just come and obliterate large swathes of like the human work that was done before. Do you think that we might see it accelerate towards standardization as more like companies try and take on the big complicated human manual work and turn it into sausage factory, spitting out similar things?
Yeah, I think there is a trend that way, obviously, with all the data from smart meters and every other sensor, and sensors are so cheap now, and these sort of digital tools ultimately in feeding into AI, that becomes an easier way of standardizing it. And clearly the banks and financial institutions are interested in that because it will help standardize. And if you can standardize it, that makes it easier to finance, as I've said. So it definitely has a role to play. I think, well, you and I have talked before about AI, I think. I mean, obviously it's going to be massive, but at the same time I have a high degree of skepticism, and one should never forget the old computer expression that we were brought up on, which is garbage in, garbage out. And that's a bit worrying. But fundamentally data collection, and I talked about metered efficiencies earlier. You couldn't have that without smart meters and massive data transfer and data processing in a way that, again, we could never have imagined in the 1980s when we were using remote mainframes to do things. On the odd occasions we got to use a computer.
And I think it's hard to, even like 5 years ago, understand where technology was going to get to. Do you think that data analytics, digital tooling, do you think it's making projects more investable? Do you think it is helping?
Well, I think it will, as I said, and I do like the metered efficiency example, which comes from the US and pioneered by the Open EE meter and a company called Recurve Inc., founded by a good friend of mine, Matt Golden. And that sort of metered efficiency approach allows utilities to really optimize their investment. So they've got money to spend, some of which is sort of grant money, as we would call it, or program money. And they're affected by obviously solar and batteries, and their load curves are changing. And they can really use data to be very precise in saying, well, in this particular area, near to this particular substation, it would be sensible for us to spend some money subsidizing heat pumps, for instance, whereas in another area it might be better to subsidize something else. And so you get that very precise targeting that can only come from big data, I suppose, and analyzing it in that way. And whereas in the past it would be based on not much data really, and traditional engineering approach, which would have been, oh, let's spend 50 million upgrading the substation or whatever.
Yeah, I'd not thought of it like that. Like, you're looking at, you're finally kind of able to look at the other side of the equation, even though, because it's intractable to a single human, but now the tooling's there and you can look at it, and actually the asymmetry in investment and change and all that makes quite the difference. So what about like developments like distributed batteries, more flexibility, virtual power plants? Do these excite you? Like, how are we making the right use of them? Do you see them evolving over the next decade?
Yeah, I think that's going to be the biggest sort of impact over the next decade, and that's why we're working on all of those things. I think that sort of cheap solar and cheap batteries, people haven't really caught up with yet, and they will only get cheaper and better performing, as we know. So I think we're just at the beginning of that revolution, if you like, and fundamentally what it tells you is every building should be a solar generator, and every building should have a battery, and batteries at all scales. I mean, we've seen some business models in the US which are people giving away batteries and then obviously benefiting from the flexibility and giving the consumer some benefit. And then you've also seen electric cookers with built-in batteries even that can talk to the grid. So I think at every scale, from a big industrial and commercial site down to a house and even down to appliances perhaps, you will get those sort of developments with batteries and flexibility markets. And that's really exciting because, I mean, we just saw recently, I think in California, I think they had one day, was it February the 1st, when the whole demand for 24 hours was basically met by solar and the portfolio of batteries across the state. And again, if you'd gone back 40 years and said, oh, you know, California will be able to do that, everybody would have laughed you out of court. It would have been impossible. And as it gets cheaper, that will inevitably spread. So, you know, I think that is science fiction coming true, really. And the other interesting aspect of all of that, which I always flag up, is this close link between electrical power and political power. Doesn't matter what country you're in, there's always been a very, very close link between political power and electrical power. And when you start to decentralize electrical power, it's going to be really interesting to see what impact it has on the political power.
Anywhere is there anywhere at the forefront of that happening that you can point us at and that you think, or are we still too early?
Well, I think you're still seeing this sort of battles between the incumbents, and maybe we'll talk a bit about that. But you know, the incumbents obviously want to stop it, and they have in many places, you know, certain states in the US, there's been corruption cases, but at the end of the day, the power company has a lot of power over what happens directly, and they have a lot of lobbyists, whereas the energy efficiency people and individuals don't. So the battle will play out, but at the end of the day, economics tends to win.
And do you think that ends up being like a barrier to true innovation as well? Like from where I see it, I've just spoiler alert, I do. I think that if especially public capital, but also even private like investment was more centered around some of the groundbreaking stuff that could happen and wasn't just concentrated into the pockets that have been doing the same stuff for years, like I think we would see a lot more change, because anyone that's done business with large enterprise scale incumbents will understand very quickly how hard it is to achieve innovation in some of these organizations. Because surprise, when you add 10,000 professionals into the mix that all have an opinion, you get a lot of disagreements.
Well, I think there's always going to be noise and propaganda from incumbents as well, and as I said, a lot of lobbying and roadblocks. Plus, of course, the energy industry, for good reason, is very tightly regulated. Regulation takes time to catch up as well, as we've seen here. And in all countries, regulation is trying to catch up with these changes. I think also big corporates. There's a difference between big corporates and startups. Big corporates have a proven business model that they operate, and woe betide if you try and change it, it's really difficult. Whereas startups are kind of quasi-organizations looking for a business model that works that they haven't quite found yet. And when they found it and it's operating, they grow and then they get absorbed into bigger companies. And so it's very hard in big companies to innovate. They all have innovation centers and innovation directors, but it's really hard because you're fighting against a system that works every day and generates returns every day.
Had the head of innovation from NISO on recently, and that is I think an unenviable job. Great fun, significant breadth and power, ability to really make significant change, but cripes, must be difficult, so heavily regulated, all eyes are watching you, you'll upset someone no matter what you do, that kind of role. But I think good to see how she gets on and the things that happen, because they are doing some interesting stuff, especially around data sharing and transparency.
Yeah, they are, and I think they do well. But as you say, very difficult to make that kind of change in big organisations.
And is it true? We talked about the US a little bit. Is it true on the continent? You've worked quite closely with a lot of European initiatives. What lessons do you think we could learn from people over in the continent?
Well, I think they have taken on board more this idea of what I call de-risking tools and transaction enablers. And de-risking tools can be anything from guarantees or first loss reserves, things like that, that de-risk a project. And then transaction enablers could be anything from sort of aggregating small projects to things like the investor confidence project that helps transactions move forward. And then even framework agreements. And one that I always quote here is the Carbon and Energy Fund, which is not a fund, but it operates as a framework in the NHS and helps them develop big energy saving projects. So it helps accelerate and enable transactions to happen. And I had written a lot and talked about these ideas for a long time. And back in the day when we had a green investment bank, I was quite vocal saying that's what they should be doing, rather than lending money to projects that would attract private money all day long.
Mm-hmm.
And then they set the National Infrastructure Bank, and I said the same, and they kind of did the same. And now it's the National Wealth Fund. I think they're starting to think about these things. There's been a bit of an emphasis on guarantees. I think the problem, being skeptical, is that, investment bankers, like everybody, respond to incentives. And when the incentive is to do deals, they tend to do the biggest, simplest deal they can do. Whereas the ones we really need, like energy efficiency or whole house retrofit or stuff like that, is actually really difficult. So I think if I was Chancellor for one day, not that I want to be Chancellor, but if I was Chancellor, I'd make sure all the public money went on de-risking tools and transaction enablers that actually allow the private money to flow. And institutions, well, like the EU, but also aid development agencies like the World Bank kind of talk a lot about this. And it's really proven. I mean, I wrote a whole guide to financing energy efficiency for buildings in the Arab region for UNESCO, the regional UN agency, and that really captures a lot of thinking, and it captures a lot of the international examples which really show that work. So, for a small amount of public money, you can catalyze a large amount of private money if you put these de-risking tools and transaction enablers in place.
Yeah, I like that idea. I can see how that plays out, where the government is effectively playing that safety net role, de-risk things, make everything easier and easier and easier, so that all the risk can be captured by private money and venture funds and startups and stuff, because that's what they're there for, right? Is to try and make a big upside, whereas the government doesn't need to make a huge upside. It just needs to make sure things move and the private sector is doing well enough. But I've not thought of it that way around. So you've written a lot about the kind of non-technological stuff as well. Organisational barriers, like cultural issues in organisations, and non-technical stuff that acts as a barrier to the transition. Like, where do you think the biggest ones are, and what are the lessons learned for people in the audience?
Yeah, well, we're all human, and human factors are always a big impact. And personally, I love this kind of technological change and everything we're talking about, but I don't like change in many other areas of life. That's just the way we are, isn't it? It's weird. But organizations are hard to change. Like I said earlier, big organizations are machines that are set up to run proven processes. That's what they are, whatever else they might say. And it's hard to change those processes, and it's hard to change people out of their comfort zone. And I'll give you a specific example, which is Edina. Edina is a leading gas engine, CHP, and stationary power company. And we're invested in it alongside EESL, the Indian agency that I mentioned at the beginning. And in that company, you have literally some of the world's experts in gas engines. And when we said, well, look, okay, gas will last perhaps longer than some people think, but you've got to really think about batteries and alternatives. And of course, everybody came back and said, well, there's no market. We don't know anything about batteries. There's no maintenance revenue. It went on. And then finally, they said they looked seriously, and they developed a battery product. And now a good proportion of their revenue is from battery projects and hybrid projects. But they had 200 people who are experts in gas engines. You can't expect them tomorrow to be experts in batteries. It just doesn't work that way. And we're all attached to our kind of past identity and our education and training. And it's really hard to change that stuff. And I think also that's also a good example, because with gas engines, just like with internal combustion engine cars, there's a huge tail of maintenance revenue. which is really important. I mean, the car dealers are facing this problem big time now. It's like, hang on, if everybody switches to EVs, all those spare parts, all that work that's done to maintain your car, all that revenue flow just completely disappears. And it's like, oops, now what do we do? That is a major fundamental problem that stops change, really. So yeah, the human factors are always, and organizational factors are always important. And there's kind of rational reasons behind them. And it's really easy when you're on the outside to say, oh, you're just being stupid or irrational, or, you don't know what you're talking about. But actually, when you analyze it, it's totally rational that people wouldn't want to change.
When I'm sort of like helping people become consultants and think about it, I talk about that very problem. And I say, no one knowingly makes an irrational or stupid decision. Very rarely do people on purpose do something that they know to be wrong. So no matter how stupid or silly you think the other person is, they have reasons to think they're right. And your job is to understand those reasons and bridge the gap. And I think like I learned that when I was quite young, actually, in my career. And I think it's helped me so much that like everyone has a history, the sonder, right? They've got a full life, they've got a history, they've got a background. They're not being awkward for the sake of it. There's a good reason. And if you can just get to the reason, they usually defrost and you usually go hand in hand and tackle the problem together. It's such a thing. And I've got separate about being able to put down past experience and education. I've got a manager at the moment in Hypercube who's going on the journey of learning leadership and things. And she's excellent, and she's very much struggling with the not being the techie that with the hand on the keyboard build the thing and giving it up to other people. And I kind of said, look, like all my job now is to talk to people. I just talk all the time because that is actually the kind of programming language of organizational action, right? Like I know that my system, like by making my systems and my processes and the team work, someone that's much better than me at hands on keyboard will do the work better than me. And you just have to give up that trust. But it is so difficult to go, okay, I've spent all these years learning this niche technical skill set that I've been paid for, and that has to go because the next tier of whatever I'm trying to achieve actually is a completely different game. So I identify with that quite strongly.
Yeah, I did write about this fairly recently. In fact, well, I say I wrote about it recently. I kind of reused some of my PhD from the early 80s, and the title of it was Don't Assume Sloth, Bias or Ignorance. And where that came from was energy managers are always saying, I've got all these great 2-year payback projects and management won't do them. And sometimes there's perfectly rational reasons. Sometimes there's kind of irrational reasons, in not contradicting what you said, but sometimes people have got the wrong belief about a system or whatever. But there could be perfectly rational reasons why a company doesn't invest in a 2-year energy saving project. Maybe it makes more sense to spend the money on developing a new product or a bit of marketing. It may make sense, but people tend to assume the people saying no are ignorant or don't know what they're talking about. So yeah.
And I feel myself doing it because people all the time say to me again, like, oh, why don't we do this? Or you should just do that. And they come up with an idea. And like in the vacuum that it was come up with, it is a great idea. And you think you're really clever. That's wonderful. But so often I feel the pain of myself saying, but there's all this other stuff and I can't. And it's like, I don't want to explain the whole universe every time. And it's a frustration that I'm not communicating maybe enough of the wider piece for people to get the context. So I can feel myself being that frustrator. And I don't know, maybe that's just my life now. Well, Steve, it's been absolutely amazing speaking to you today. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to us and sharing your insights and things you've seen and predict for the energy system to come. Before I let anyone leave, I always just like to ask if there's anything you'd like to promote or plug, or if people want to find out more about you or EP Group, where should we point them?
Well, I think you've been kind enough to mention my blog, only11%.com. And of course, I have some books. I think the best known is just called Energy Efficiency, and that's currently available on Amazon in paperback, which finally makes it more affordable. And then in terms of EP Group, we have epgroup.com, or better still, just reach out directly for a conversation. I'm not too hard to find.
Thank you so much once again, and look forward to perusing the book and the blog and speaking to you again very soon.
Okay, thank you, Adam.
Thank you once again for listening to the Hypercube Energy Podcast. As always, if you have any feedback or comments or you want to get involved, please get in touch. And if you want to find out more about what's happening in data and AI across the energy sector, please join the Beyond Energy community. And I look forward to speaking to you soon.